expect the word, engaged, to feel like a fluorescent sticker on my forehead. But the moment the ring flashed under the kitchen light and my mother saw it, I could almost hear the imaginary trumpet fanfare she'd been saving since my first school dance. I told her on a quiet Sunday because I thought it would buy us a gentler landing, a slower heartbeat, a chance to describe the kind of wedding my fiancé and I wanted without an audience. Instead, she gasped, wrapped me in the kind of embrace that always smelled faintly of perfume counters and roasted garlic, and started talking as if we had somehow wandered into her memory instead of our future. She said we would need a ballroom with ceilings high enough for chandeliers to look modest, and a band that understood real Italian standards. And I laughed the nervous laugh I always laugh with her, the one that sounds like agreement even when my hands go cold. I tried, in that first hour, to float my version like a paper boat on a choppy canal. I told her we imagined mountains, 4 hours up the highway, a place where the air is thin enough to make voices softer, and where my grandparents could still manage the drive. I said we weren't trying to run away, not from the family, not from tradition, just from the feeling of being on stage. I said we wanted 100 people, maybe 150 if we counted cousins we actually remember from holidays, and she smiled the way she smiles at children who declare they will live on cookies forever. She said of course we could talk about somewhere pretty for photos, but a wedding was not a weekend trip with matching mugs. A wedding was a declaration to the city and the neighborhood and the old women who sat in front of the church every Sunday pretending not to keep score. In her vocabulary, destination translated cleanly to insult. The calls began before I'd finished the leftovers. A cousin I hadn't seen in 5 years texted 3 confetti emojis and asked about blocks of hotel rooms in case the city sells out. My godmother left a voicemail so warm it made me want to call back immediately and apologize for something I hadn't done yet. A neighbor congratulated me in the produce aisle and said my mother had promised to keep them in the loop, and wasn't it thrilling about the band. Each conversation pressed on the same bruise, the sense that a parade had been scheduled, and my job was to bring the parade to me whether I wanted it or not. When I asked my mother how this had happened, she said she had simply told people that once we set a date, invitations would follow, as if invitations were a weather pattern she had learned to forecast. She was smiling when she said it. She believed herself generous. My fiancé listened with his steady patience while the phone lit up and dimmed again on the coffee table. He's not a party person. He shrinks from rooms that require smiling in a radius. He said he wanted to get married to me, not to a guest list, and I felt a ridiculous wave of gratitude for something that should have been obvious. We planned privately, because planning publicly felt like feeding an engine I didn't understand. We wrote down the mountain venue that allowed dogs and imagined our 2 ridiculous animals trotting down the aisle with ribbons like dignified village messengers. We sketched a list of people whose numbers we had memorized and who had watched us learn to be kind to each other. The rule came out of me before I could workshop it. We don't want to meet anyone new at our wedding. I waited for it to sound cruel out loud. It didn't. It sounded like telling the truth before the lie had time to practice. Every time I said the mountain idea to my mother, she nearly swooned as if oxygen had been suddenly rationed. She said grandparents cannot climb mountains, which is objectively true, and I said the venue sits by a lake and is flatter than our street. She said people with obligations cannot disappear for a weekend, and I said the drive is shorter than most commutes when the city is angry. She said 100 guests is not a wedding, it's a rehearsal. She said we should aim for 500 because 500 is dignity, and dignity is our inheritance. I knew what she meant. Her wedding had been a census and an oath. Every cousin's face a receipt for all the dinners her mother had cooked, and all the times her father had said, "My door is open," and meant it. In her story, a big wedding is proof that love can be counted. In mine, love is a room small enough to hear each other breathe. I kept thinking I would find the perfect sentence that unclenched her jaw, a line that offered respect without surrender, and every time I tried, I heard myself sounding either like a teenager or a bureaucrat. The day she asked about Great Aunt Tina, it was mid-afternoon, and I was stirring sauce because I stir sauce when I need time to read myself. She said Aunt Tina would be heartbroken to miss the ceremony, and I said I adored Aunt Tina and also had not seen her in 3 years because she moved 2 states away and only comes back for funerals. She said funerals shouldn't be the only reason people travel for family. She had me there, briefly. And then, without transition, she told me she had been keeping a little list. Nothing formal, just names of those who would certainly be thrilled to celebrate us. The baker who made my communion cake, the neighbor who once watched our dog while we went on vacation, a cousin's college roommate who had family in town, 4 of her clients who always ask about me. I felt the floor tilt the way it does when you stand on a ferry and stare at a fixed point on land. You know you are moving, but your body insists the opposite. It didn't help that she has this habit of writing, +3, next to her own name on formal invitations, translating 2 seats into 5 with the confidence of someone who has never been denied. She's proud of it. She calls it Italian math and says it with a wink that expects laughter. I've never laughed. I've only watched other people accommodate her as if accommodating her were a natural part of hospitality, a ritual like blessing the bread. No one had ever told her no, which meant my no would register not as a boundary, but as a rupture. When my soon-to-be mother-in-law asked, gently, how she could help, I felt a wave of relief so strong it was almost embarrassment. She said she remembers what it's like to plan while people insert their dreams into your day like spare batteries, and she said she would follow our lead. My mother loves her and resents her in the same sentence. She calls her chill, which in my family is code for not keeping score. I could feel the axis forming. 2 women with their own definitions of good mother, 2 models of love that don't overlap even when everyone is being polite. The first real skirmish happened over a group chat my mother created without asking. She titled it La Famiglia Wedding Day and added 34 people, some of whom I know only by nicknames I can't attach to faces. She posted a picture of the ring and a photo of a ballroom she'd visited with a client, and there were 100 heart emojis stacked like confetti. I typed out a message about how grateful we were and how we were looking at a mountain venue that made sense for the grandparents, and my thumb hovered above send, as if send could detonate something irreversible. I pressed it anyway. Silence followed, the breathable kind, and then my mother replied with 3 rose emojis and a sentence that felt like a sermon. She said, of course, we could consider all options and that the most important thing was having everyone together to witness our love. She used my full name, which is how she tells me she is both proud and furious. That night I couldn't sleep. The ceiling looked like paper soaked in water, seams softening. I kept rehearsing arguments I didn't want to have, lines about budgets and logistics, and none of them touched the center of the problem, which is that my mother treats joy like a communal resource, and I treat it like a fragile object that needs 2 steady hands. I asked myself whether I was being selfish for wanting a day that would not require handshakes with strangers who would say I have grown so much since they last saw me, and whether selfishness is automatically a sin if it is the only way to breathe. My fiancé reached for my hand in his sleep, and I found my answer in the unremarkable warmth of his fingers. It is not a sin to know the shape of your own lungs. I told my mother we would visit the mountain venue, and that it would help me to make the decision if she and my father came along, because I knew she needed to see where happiness might live before she agreed to let it. On the drive up, she narrated her wedding the way she always does, when the road opens and nostalgia has room to sit in the passenger seat. She told me how her parents had cried when they saw the sea of faces, how even the waiter from their favorite restaurant came in during his break, how the priest had said he had never seen so many people cross themselves in rhythm. My father chuckled at every third sentence the way he always does, providing punctuation, and my mother told him not to downplay the effort, as if anyone could. I answered in gentler tones than I felt. I needed her to feel invited, even as I stacked quiet sandbags against the flood. The venue was everything I had hoped. A wooden hall that smelled like cedar and thyme, windows that framed water and sky in matching stripes, a dock wide enough for photographs that wouldn't look like photographs. The coordinator walked us through the schedule with the calm of someone who has seen every version of Panic. She said they often host weddings around 100 guests, and that the room looks best when you can still hear forks on plates. My mother nodded with the blank expression she uses when accepting facts, only to discard them later in her own kitchen. She asked about expanding the space with a tent. She asked how many chairs could be rented from other sources. She asked whether it was possible to do a second reception in the city for those who could not travel, which sounded like arranging 2 first days of school to avoid choosing which parent you love more. I kept my voice even. I said we wanted to pay for this ourselves because paying is, for us, part of the meaning, and she looked wounded for a second and then rearranged her face into something supportive. She said of course we could pay if that made us feel independent, but she and my father would contribute because parents contribute, and when parents contribute, they must be allowed to invite a few people out of respect. And didn't I see how these ideas braid together? I said I saw it, and I also saw the bruise my own future was pressing against. The coordinator handed us a sample contract and asked about dates. I loved the thinness of January up there, how sound travels softly over snow, but we chose early fall because my grandparents' joints keep their own calendar. Back in the car, my mother was uncharacteristically quiet. I thought, briefly, that the water had calmed something in her, that the trees had argued on my behalf in a language she obeyed instinctively. We stopped for espresso in a town that looks like postcards hang themselves in shop windows. When we sat down, she reached for my hand in a gesture so theatrical it would have been funny if I hadn't been braced for it. She said she understood that I wanted something intimate, and that intimacy can be beautiful, and she would never want to place vanity over my happiness. Then she inhaled, and the second act began. She said she had been thinking about my grandparents and my aunts who bake for days before any event, and the cousins who have small children and cannot travel with nap schedules and husbands who work Saturdays, and how excluding them would write history in a way she could not read. She said family is not a guest list. It is an obligation. She said this in her church voice. Obligation sounded like God. The espresso went bitter in my mouth. I heard myself explain again that we were not excluding anyone. We were creating a wedding we could inhabit without needing to act. I reminded her that the room has a capacity. The fire marshal is not a metaphor. I said I would rather spend a long dinner with 100 people who would notice if I tripped on my dress than a crowded blur where even my name would feel like a stage direction. She tapped a sugar packet against the table and told me gently that I would regret this someday, that when I looked back at the photos and saw absences, the absences would grow like mold in the album. I asked her, before I could edit myself, if she would regret not having the exact wedding she had for me. The question hung there like music cut off mid-note. She put the sugar down and smiled at me as if I were 7 and demanding to cut my own hair. We got through that conversation the way we get through all of them, circling the perimeter until fatigue felt like agreement. On the ride home, she pointed out farm stands and said the tomatoes up there must be sweet enough to justify the drive for anyone who loves me. I almost believed we had reached an understanding until my phone vibrated with a message I wasn't meant to see yet. It was a forwarded email from a family friend to my mother with the subject line, "Congratulations, ballroom on hold." The friend had a cousin who managed a massive venue downtown, and the cousin had penciled us in, and my mother had replied with 15 exclamation points and a sentence that made my stomach drop even before I finished reading. She told the cousin that we were finalizing dates, and she would bring a deposit by Friday to secure the room, because once the children came to their senses and realized city weddings are simpler, there would be a rush on Saturdays. I stared at the screen long enough for the car to drift toward the rumble strip. My fiancé touched my knee and asked if I needed him to drive. I said no and handed him the phone because I needed to watch someone else read the lines I couldn't digest. He inhaled slowly, the way he does before he tells a patient that something is going to hurt, and then it will stop. I knew then that we had been speaking different languages to my mother. I had been offering adjectives, and she had been collecting nouns. I had been negotiating tone, and she had been booking rooms. The mini-climax came in the kitchen that night, as if kitchens were built specifically for our arguments. I told her I'd seen the email, and she said she had only asked them to hold the date because good dates vanish if you don't act. And I said I didn't want the date or the room, and she said we could do both, mountain for the ceremony and city for the reception, and I said I wouldn't split myself in half so other people didn't have to drive, and she said I was being selfish, and I said I was finally being honest. The volume never rose. We are not a shouting family. We are a family that uses sentences like needles. She told me I would break my grandmother's heart. I told her I was trying not to break my own. For a brief, impossible minute, something in her face softened. She looked at me the way she looked at me when I was little and had a fever, like she was calculating the distance between care and control and wasn't sure where to stand. I thought she might say she understood. I thought she might say what I had always wanted to hear, that my happiness did not have to be translated into her dialect to be real. Then her phone lit up with another message from the ballroom cousin asking if Friday still worked, and my mother, without thinking, typed yes. I felt the ground shift in that quiet way that means the damage will be structural. I told her calmly that if she paid a deposit, I would not attend whatever event she booked. I said it without drama, like reading a prescription label. She laughed, uncertain whether I was joking, and said no one refuses a ballroom that generous. I told her I was refusing it. She said families make compromises. I said this was my compromise. A wedding we could live inside, a guest list that didn't require name tags, a mountain close enough for the people who raised us to reach us, dogs carrying rings because it made us happy and because joy does not need permission. She said dogs are not ring bearers in photographs you frame. I said they are in mine. When we finally paused, I felt wrung out and oddly clear. She stood at the sink rinsing cups we hadn't used and said we would talk again tomorrow as if time worked for her. I went home and opened the laptop and drafted an email to the mountain venue asking about available dates. I needed something written that could not be interrupted. My fiancé sat beside me and spelled the names of our grandparents carefully, as if spelling them were a blessing. We chose a Saturday early enough in the season that the air would be crisp and the roads kinder. I closed my eyes and pictured the lake catching the light like a quiet applause. The confirmation from the venue arrived at 8:14 a.m. with a tidy contract and a polite instruction to wire the deposit within 5 business days. I felt relief flicker like a porch light at dusk. I texted my mother to tell her we had held the mountain date and would sign that afternoon, and I asked her not to put money anywhere else because we were paying and we had decided. She didn't reply immediately, which I told myself could mean anything. I made coffee. I sent the wire. I printed the contract and signed my name so carefully it looked like a stranger had forged it. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a single sentence from my mother, cheerful like a parade announcer. She said it was perfect timing because she had just dropped off a deposit at the ballroom so we would have options, and we could announce both and let people pick what worked. And wasn't it lucky to be so loved that 2 rooms wanted us? The email sat on the screen like a bruise. My mother's cheerful message at the top, the attached receipt beneath it, the number in bold, $5,000 non-refundable deposit. She had done it. She had made her version of the wedding reel with money, and money had always been the final word in our family. For a long minute, I just stared at it. My fiancé, Mark, leaned over my shoulder and whispered that we could still fix it. His voice was gentle, careful, as though the wrong tone might make the glass shatter. I nodded, though the motion felt disconnected from thought. Fixing meant confronting her, and confronting her always meant a war disguised as a conversation. I called her anyway. She answered before the first ring finished, her voice bright as confetti. "I knew you'd see it my way, sweetheart. The ballroom is breathtaking. Wait until you see the chandeliers." I said her name instead of Mom. It came out small and strange. "You had no right to make that payment. I told you we'd already booked the mountain." She sighed, that long exhale she's perfected over decades of motherhood, the one that carries disappointment and martyrdom in equal parts. "Honey, you're overwhelmed. You'll thank me later. Everyone will expect a city wedding. This just gives us options." There it was again, us. The invisible merger between her identity and mine, a shared ownership she never questioned. "I'm not overwhelmed," I said, my voice shaking anyway. "I'm angry. You're treating my wedding like it's yours." Her tone cooled. "You wouldn't even have a wedding if it weren't for us. We're offering to pay to take care of everything. I thought you'd appreciate some initiative." I almost laughed. Initiative was what she called control when someone tried to name it. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, listening to Mark breathe, my mind replaying every conversation I'd ever had with her that ended with me apologizing for wanting something she hadn't chosen first. When the sun came up, I drafted an email to the ballroom manager explaining that the event had been booked without my consent and that I expected the reservation to be canceled immediately. I signed it with my full name and my fiancé's, our shared account number on the mountain contract beneath it. By noon, the manager replied politely that he couldn't refund the deposit because my mother had signed as the paying client. That single line, the paying client, made my stomach twist. It wasn't about the money. It was about the idea that she now owned a piece of my wedding, legally and symbolically. When I told her the deposit was non-refundable, she said, "Then you might as well use it." Mark and I drove to her house that evening. The air inside smelled like espresso and triumph. She'd already printed brochures from the ballroom, spread them across the dining table like a realtor staging an open house. My father sat at the head of the table reading the sports section, a neutral flag in a war zone. "Sit," she said, as though we were guests. "Let's go over the seating plan." I looked at the papers, glossy images of golden drapery, round tables for 12, a platform for a live band, and felt the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from years of repeating the same conversation in different disguises. "I'm not sitting," I said quietly. "I'm leaving, and I'm asking you one last time to cancel the ballroom." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're being dramatic. Everyone's excited. You should see the messages I've gotten." "That's the problem," I cut in. "You're planning a celebration for everyone except me." Her smile vanished. "Watch your tone," she said, and I heard my father's newspaper rustle like a warning. "Mom," I tried again, gentler this time. "We're adults. We want a small ceremony. Please respect that." She folded her arms. "You're ungrateful. You think this is easy for me, to sit back and watch my only daughter throw away tradition." There it was, the guilt card, as predictable as sunrise. I felt the old reflex kick in, the urge to apologize, to soothe, to promise compromise. But I stayed still. I thought about the email confirmation from the mountain venue sitting in my inbox, about how my name looked on the contract, mine, not hers. Mark spoke before I could. "We're paying for the wedding," he said firmly, "which means we're making the decisions. Please don't spend any more money on this." She stared at him like he'd spoken another language. "I wasn't talking to you," she said. He didn't flinch. "You are now." The silence that followed was thick, electric. My father finally lowered the newspaper. "Maybe we should all cool off," he muttered, but no one moved. "I'm canceling the ballroom," I said. "If you want to waste the deposit, that's your choice, but I won't show up." Her eyes narrowed. "You'd embarrass the family like that." "I'm not embarrassing anyone. I'm protecting myself." The argument ended when my father stood up and walked out of the room. That was his way of signaling that nothing more could be said. My mother sat back down, lips pressed tight, her fingers tapping the table in an invisible rhythm. When we left, she didn't hug me. She only said, "You'll regret this when the family turns their backs on you." I didn't answer. In the weeks that followed, the pressure came from every direction. Aunts called to check in. Cousins messaged about what color dresses to buy. Even my grandmother phoned one evening, whispering in a conspiratorial tone that she understood I was under stress, and that it was okay. I didn't have to plan anything. My mother would handle it. Mark told me to stop picking up calls. I tried, but the silence felt like disobedience. Every ring sounded like another test of loyalty. At work, I was useless, drafting emails that read like apologies, deleting them, rewriting them again. I'm a project coordinator. Organization is supposed to be my superpower. But now even grocery lists looked accusatory. 2 weeks later, the group chat, La Famiglia Wedding Day, lit up with photos of the ballroom menu and comments like "This is going to be the event of the year." I felt my throat tighten. My mother hadn't said a word to me since our fight, but she was clearly moving forward. I left the chat without a message. Seconds later, my phone buzzed. "Why would you do that?" from her. I typed, "Because it isn't my wedding," then deleted it and replaced it with, "Please remove me from anything related to the ballroom." Her reply came fast. "You're acting like a stranger." Maybe I was. Maybe that was the point. That night, I called my grandmother again, not the whispering one, but my father's mother, the quieter side of the family. She lives alone and has never taken sides in anything, which makes her dangerous in my mother's eyes. I told her about the 2 weddings, about the deposit, about how exhausted I was from being the villain in a story I didn't write. She listened without interrupting, then said, "Your mother only knows one way to love loudly. Sometimes people mistake volume for devotion." I asked what I was supposed to do. "Lower your own voice," she said. "Eventually she'll have to lean in to hear you." It was the kind of advice that sounded simple and impossible at the same time. A month passed. The mountain venue sent a reminder about the remaining balance. Mark and I transferred the payment in silence, the click of the mouse heavier than any argument. It was done. The date was ours. When I finally told my mother, she said she couldn't possibly attend because she had already promised the ballroom deposit would not go to waste. She would host a family reception in the city on the same weekend. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, but decisively, like a thread pulled too tight finally letting go. "Then you'll have your party," I said, "and I'll have my wedding." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice so calm it frightened me, she said, "You'll regret shutting us out." Maybe she was right. Maybe I would. But when I hung up, the air in the apartment felt lighter. I looked at Mark and realized I'd been holding my breath for months. He smiled, a little tired, a little proud. "You said no," he whispered. And for the first time, no didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like oxygen. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. My mother doesn't surrender. She recalculates. I just didn't know what she was planning yet. It took her exactly 11 days to launch her counterattack. Not through confrontation. My mother preferred subtler weapons. She began with charm. The first wave came disguised as reconciliation, an email titled, "Just Wanna Talk." She congratulated us on securing our date, as though she had been part of the decision, and mentioned how proud she was that we were taking responsibility like real adults. The words sounded sweet, but I could feel the hook beneath them. A single sentence gave her away. "Of course, I've been telling everyone how beautiful the mountain will look in the photos. We just have to make sure there's enough room for everyone to feel included." Everyone. That word had become radioactive. Mark read the email over my shoulder and said, "She's testing you. Don't answer." But I did. I wrote back, careful, diplomatic. "Mom, we're keeping it small, just family and close friends. Please don't invite anyone yourself." Her reply came within minutes. "Of course, I understand completely, but you know how people talk. It would be rude to exclude the neighbors, especially after they already bought gifts." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Gifts? We hadn't even sent invitations yet. Over the next week, the situation evolved from annoying to absurd. I started receiving messages from people I hadn't spoken to since middle school. They congratulated me, asked about hotels, dietary preferences, even dress codes. Every time I asked where they'd heard about the wedding, the answer was the same. Your mom told us you'd be thrilled to have us. The mountain venue suddenly felt smaller. I drove to my parents' house that Sunday, determined to stop the chaos before it spread further. The smell of tomato sauce hit me before I even opened the front door, her armor, her peace offering. She greeted me as if nothing were wrong, kissed my cheek, asked if Mark wanted seconds before I'd even sat down. Mom, I said softly, you need to stop inviting people. She froze for half a second, then laughed. Oh, honey, I'm not inviting anyone. People are just excited. You can't control excitement. I stared at her. You literally told our old neighbor that she'd get an invitation. Her eyes flicked away. She's like family. She's not, I said, my voice shaking now. She's someone you nod to when you take out the trash. Watch your tone, she warned, the warmth leaving her face. You're forgetting who raised you. I exhaled slowly. You raised me to be polite, not obedient. Her lips parted, ready to fire back, but she stopped herself. Instead, she reached for the ladle, poured more sauce over my plate and said, "Eat. You'll feel better." That was her final defense mechanism. Feed the problem until it looks like love. The next escalation came quietly. Mark and I were at home one evening when a large box arrived at our door. Inside were custom-printed invitations, thick cream paper, gold lettering, embossed with vines and doves. The return address read, "The Caselli family invites you to celebrate the marriage of their daughter." Not we, not Mark and I, just their daughter. My hands trembled as I flipped through the stack. At the bottom of the box, there was a note. "Surprise! I had them done early, less stress for you. Don't worry, I'll handle the mailing list. Love, Mom." Mark picked one up and turned it over. Did she actually order 500 of these? 550, I whispered, reading the invoice. I felt heat rush to my face, a mix of anger and shame. She had used my full legal name, our wedding date, even the mountain venue, as though stamping her approval made it official. "I'm calling her," I said. Mark touched my wrist. "Not while you're shaking." He was right, but I called anyway. She answered on speaker, her tone cheerful and practiced. "So, you got them. Aren't they stunning? My friend's daughter is a graphic designer. She did the calligraphy by hand." "Mom," I said carefully, "you had no right to do that." "Oh, please, I was helping. You're always saying how busy you are. You didn't even use our names together." There was a pause. Then lightly, "Well, traditionally, the bride's family sends the invitation. It's our gift." "It's not a gift," I snapped. "It's a takeover." Her voice sharpened. "You are not going to speak to me like that. I've spent months planning this, calling vendors, making sure everything looks perfect. Do you have any idea what people would think if I backed out now?" Finally, the truth. It wasn't about me. It was about people. The invisible audience she'd been performing for since before I could form memories. "Then let them think whatever they want," I said. "You can tell them the truth, that your daughter finally learned how to say no." She inhaled sharply. "If you don't appreciate what I'm doing, maybe we shouldn't come at all." For a second, the silence was dizzying. Then I said, "Maybe you shouldn't." She hung up. For 2 weeks, there was nothing. No calls, no texts. The quiet felt unnatural, like walking through a familiar room and realizing a piece of furniture is missing. I wanted to believe the fight was over, but deep down I knew better. On the third Sunday, my aunt called. Her voice was a whisper, conspiratorial. "You didn't hear this from me, but your mom's organizing a family dinner next weekend. Says it's to discuss the situation." The situation. That was her word for anything she couldn't control. I didn't want to go, but Mark insisted we should at least hear what she had to say. "You can't fix what you do confront," he said, ever the rational one. We showed up early, hopping to make it quick. My father opened the door, his expression neutral, eyes tired. In the dining room, the table was set for 12. My mother stood at the head like a general awaiting her troops. "Thank you for coming," she said, smiling tightly. There were already relatives there. My aunt, 2 cousins, my grandmother. The air smelled like baked ziti and performance. "I just thought," my mother began, "that it would be good for everyone to talk openly about what's happening. Family should be together on happy occasions, not divided." I knew what this was. A tribunal. She gestured to my aunt. "Tell her how you felt when you heard she was cutting the family out of the wedding." My aunt looked uncomfortable but complied. "I just think it's sad. We all love you. We want to celebrate with you." My mother nodded as if collecting evidence. "Exactly. It's not about control, it's about love. Love doesn't need 500 witnesses," I said. Her smile faltered. "It needs community. That's how our people do things." "I'm not our people anymore," I whispered. The room went still. My grandmother looked down. My father rubbed his temples. You don't mean that, my mother said softly. I do, I said, and my throat burned. I love you, but I'm not going to let you design my life. Tears gathered in her eyes, but they weren't sorrowful. They were theatrical, precise. After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me. Mom, I'm not a project you can decorate, I said quietly. I'm your daughter. You either show up for who I am or you don't come at all. For a moment, no one breathed. Then she turned away and began clearing the untouched plates. Dinner over, she said. That night, as we drove home in silence, Mark reached for my hand. That was brutal, he said. Yeah, I murmured, staring out the window. The city lights blurred, each one a reminder of her world, loud, bright, relentless. Do you think she'll come? He asked. I hesitated. She'll come, she needs an audience. But I wasn't sure whether that thought made me comforted or terrified, because something in her eyes tonight, the way she'd gone quiet instead of shouting, told me she wasn't finished. She was simply regrouping, and I had no idea what her next move would be. The following weeks were a kind of eerie calm, the kind that makes you suspicious because you know the storm hasn't passed. It's just circling somewhere out of sight. My mother stopped calling. My phone was silent for days at a time, and instead of relief, I felt a strange, hollow vigilance, like waiting for a sound that doesn't come. Mark said it was progress. He called it boundaries working. But I'd grown up in a house where silence was never peace. It was strategy. I tried to move forward, dress fittings, menu tastings, guest confirmations, the normal rhythm of wedding planning, only quieter. Every decision felt like reclaiming a little bit of air that used to belong to her. I chose a simple satin dress, no lace, no pearls, no cathedral train. My mother would have called it plain. I called it breathable. The first sign that she hadn't disappeared came through someone else. My coworker Amy stopped by my desk one morning, holding her phone. Your mom's Facebook is amazing, she said, smiling. I frowned. What? She turned the screen toward me. There it was, an entire album titled Our Daughter's Big Day Preparations. Photos I hadn't taken, captions I hadn't written. One read, picking colors for the ballroom, she's glowing. Another, can't wait to see all our friends at the celebration. I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. The posts had hundreds of likes. Distant relatives, family friends, even old teachers had commented congratulations. Mark tried to downplay it. It's social media. People exaggerate. But I knew better. This was her new battlefield, one she could control without me interrupting. That night, I scrolled through every post, every comment. She had created her own version of reality, one where we were still planning her wedding, where the mountain venue didn't exist, where nothing had changed. It was like watching someone erase me in real time and redraw me as a character that suited their script. I typed and deleted a dozen messages before finally sending one. Take down those posts. They're misleading. She replied within minutes. They're joyful, not misleading. People are excited. You should be too. I didn't answer. Instead, I took screenshots, proof, not for her, but for myself. Evidence that I wasn't imagining it. 2 days later, I got an email from the mountain venue coordinator. Hi, just confirming your final head count. We received a large number of inquiries from guests about accommodations. Congratulations on the popularity of your event. My stomach dropped. I called immediately. What inquiries? She hesitated. Mostly people asking if we have additional rooms reserved. A few said they were told by your mother that the wedding would be open to extended family. I pressed my fingers to my temple. She's not authorized to contact you. Please only communicate with me or my fiancé. The coordinator's voice softened. I understand. It happens more often than you'd think. I thanked her, hung up, and sat staring at my reflection in the dark laptop screen. My face looked foreign, tight, drawn, older than I remembered. When Mark came home, I told him everything. He stood for a long time, silent, then said, "She's trying to make your reality look wrong so you'll surrender to hers." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit me like truth tends to, sharp, clean, unavoidable. That weekend, we decided to visit my grandmother again, the one who had told me to lower my voice. She made tea and listened as I described every new manipulation, every digital ambush, every quiet invasion of my boundaries. When I finished, she said, "Your mother doesn't understand separation. In her world, love is ownership. You're teaching her a language she doesn't know how to speak." I sighed. She doesn't want to learn. She will, my grandmother said, when she realizes she can't control you any other way. I wanted to believe her, but part of me doubted it. My mother wasn't the type to admit defeat. She would rather rewrite history than live in silence. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. It was a Thursday evening, 2 months before the wedding. I was in the middle of an online meeting when my phone started buzzing nonstop, notifications piling one after another. Texts, calls, missed messages. Finally, I opened one. It was a link, A local community blog post titled, "Upcoming Society Weddings. The Caselli Celebration Returns." My full name, the city ballroom, the date, everything. The post claimed it would be a grand event of tradition and love, hosted by the bride's family. There was even a line about hundreds expected to attend. I felt cold, the kind of cold that doesn't come from temperature but from disbelief. I called her, no greeting, no hesitation. "What did you do?" Her voice was calm. "I gave an interview. People asked about the wedding. I didn't want rumors." "Rumors?" I almost choked. "You're lying publicly about an event that doesn't exist." "Sweetheart, it's just a small announcement," she said, as if she hadn't detonated a bomb. "It keeps everyone informed. You wouldn't believe how many people are waiting to hear about it." "I'm not hosting a city wedding," I said through my teeth. "And you're not hosting anything in my name." "Well," she replied, "the deposit is non-refundable and the venue's already booked. People expect something. It would be rude to cancel now." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind replayed every instance in my life where she'd turned guilt into a leash. How every please had become an obligation, every love you a soft command. Finally, I said, "If you hold that event, you'll do it without me." Her tone dropped, ice under silk. "If you do this, you'll humiliate our entire family." "I'm not humiliating anyone," I said quietly. "You are." And then I hung up. The fallout was immediate. Relatives called, pleading, scolding, trying to mediate. Some said I was overreacting. Others whispered that they understood but couldn't say so publicly. I stopped answering altogether. Mark and I moved through the following days in a haze of logistics and nerves. I updated guest lists, confirmed accommodations, double-checked the catering. We weren't planning a wedding anymore. We were defending one. The night before our final planning meeting with the venue, I got another email, this time from the ballroom itself. "Dear Ms. Caselli, we're confirming the upcoming event under your name. We've received several payments from attendees and would like to finalize details regarding your arrival." I read it 3 times, unable to breathe. She had gone further. She had created a duplicate wedding. Mark looked over my shoulder, silent for a long time. Then he said, "She's forcing you to choose, her stage or your piece." "I've already chosen," I whispered, but I knew what it meant, that this choice would cost me something permanent. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house alone. She opened the door before I even knocked, as if she'd been waiting. "Please don't start," she said softly. "Come in, let's talk like adults." Her living room looked the same, spotless, curated, unchanged. And yet I felt like a stranger walking through a museum of someone else's memories. She poured coffee, sat across from me, and smiled. "You've made your point, darling. You're independent, you have opinions, I respect that. But now we need to fix this mess before people get confused." "There's no mess," I said. "There's just you refusing to hear me." She leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're overreacting. This isn't about control. It's about representation. People see our family a certain way." "I'm not a brand," I said. "Of course you are," she said almost tenderly. "You're my daughter." The words landed like stones. I realized then that she didn't see me as separate, not really. I was an extension, an exhibit, proof of her success as a mother. I stood up. "If you go through with that ballroom event, I won't be part of your life anymore. Not temporarily, not symbolically, completely." She blinked, startled by the flatness in my voice. "You're bluffing." "I'm not." She looked at me for a long time, studying me the way she used to when I was a teenager caught lying. Then, softly, she said, "You'll regret it." "Maybe," I said, "but at least the regret will be mine." I left without another word. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty, like someone who'd finally cut a cord only to realize how heavy it had been all along. Driving home, I kept expecting the phone to ring. It didn't. The silence this time felt different, not strategic, not threatening, just real. Still, a small voice in my head whispered what I didn't want to believe. She wouldn't stop, not yet. And as the wedding day drew closer, I began to understand. The fight wasn't about one event. It was about who I was allowed to be once it was over. The weeks leading up to the wedding blurred together, like I was moving through fog while everyone else walked in daylight. I kept telling myself I was calm, that the silence meant victory, but somewhere deep in my chest lived a restless pulse that refused to slow down. My mother had always been quietest right before doing something monumental. Mark tried to distract me with the small joys, finalizing the music, picking out flowers, driving up to the mountain one last time before the big day. Every time we reached the summit, I felt my lungs expand, as if the air itself believed in me more than I did. The venue stood exactly as I remembered it. The cedar smell, the gentle slope of the dock, the lake mirroring the sky like glass. I wanted to freeze that moment, to convince myself that the chaos below the mountain couldn't climb this high. But it could. 3 days before the ceremony, I got a call from the venue coordinator. Her tone was polite but strained. "We're receiving conflicting information about your guest list again," she said. "Several new names have appeared on the RSVP site. They're saying they were personally invited by your mother." I closed my eyes. "How many?" She hesitated. "Over 100. Mark was beside me when I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just stood there, feeling the air drain from the room. "She's doing it anyway," I said quietly. He rubbed my back. "Then we handle it. But how do you handle someone who rewrites reality every time you speak?" We drove to my parents' house that night, no warning. My father opened the door, startled but unsurprised, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The television was on in the background, news muted, captions flickering. My mother appeared in the hallway, composed as ever, wearing an apron as though preparing dinner for guests who hadn't yet arrived. "Darling," she said, smiling carefully, "you should have called. Who did you invite?" I asked. Her smile faltered. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't do that," I said. "Don't pretend." She crossed her arms. "I simply shared the information. People wanted to come. You can't blame them for caring. Caring isn't crashing a wedding. It's family. It's manipulation." Her lips tightened. "You're making this ugly." "No, Mom," I said softly. "You already did." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. My father looked between us, torn, like a man watching two tectonic plates collide beneath his living room. Finally, she said, "You should be grateful. Do you know how many people have rearranged their schedules to be there for you?" "I didn't ask them to," I said. "You don't have to ask. That's how family works." "That's how your family works," I said, and her eyes darkened, hurt and fury stitched together so tightly they were indistinguishable. "Don't say things you'll regret." "I'm already living the regret," I said. "Every day I waste explaining my life to you." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll never understand what I've sacrificed for you." I almost told her I never asked for those sacrifices, that her definition of love had always been more about control than care. But I stopped. It didn't matter anymore. I turned to my father. "If she tries to interfere again, she's not coming. I mean it." He nodded slowly, eyes downcast. "I'll talk to her," he said, though we both knew it wouldn't change anything. The next morning, I woke up to a text from my cousin. "So excited for both weddings this weekend." "Both?" I called immediately. "What do you mean both?" She hesitated. "Oh, your mom mentioned there be a city reception Sunday, the day after your mountain ceremony, just for those who couldn't travel. She said you'd make an appearance." I laughed sharp, humorless. "No, I won't." The line went quiet. "She told everyone you would." Of course she had. Mark found me packing the kitchen, my hands shaking. "She's hosting her own wedding," I said. "Without me." He blinked. "You mean like?" "Yes, a reception. My name on the invitation. I didn't even know until now." He swore under his breath. "Then we make it impossible for her to twist this any further." "How?" "By living the version she can't rewrite." The wedding day came with dawn light spilling across the mountains like gold dust. It should have been pure joy, but I carried tension in my chest like a heartbeat out of rhythm. I kept expecting her car to appear, for her to arrive with her army of uninvited guests. But when the first guests filtered in, my grandparents, a few close cousins, Mark's family, everything felt right. Small, warm, real. The ceremony began under a wooden arch my grandfather had built decades ago, the lake behind us shimmering like a promise. The dogs trotted down the aisle with ribbons tied neatly to their collars, and people laughed. Real laughter, not the polite kind. When I looked at Mark, I saw calm, steady certainty. The sound of the vows felt like finally unlocking something I hadn't realized had been sealed shut for years. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for my mother to interrupt. Halfway through the reception, while music floated across the dock and the air smelled of cedar and wine, I spotted a familiar car at the top of the hill. My pulse spiked. She stepped out slowly, dressed impeccably, as if she'd walked straight out of a magazine spread. My father followed behind, hesitant, shoulders heavy. A few heads turned. Conversations faltered. I went to meet her, before she could reach the crowd. "Mom," I said quietly, blocking her path. "Why are you here?" Her eyes glistened, a practiced mixture of hurt and innocence. "I'm your mother. Where else would I be? You said you weren't coming." She tilted her head. "I changed my mind." I glanced back at the guests, then at her. "If you came to cause a scene, don't be ridiculous," she said, adjusting her shawl. "I came to see my daughter get married." Something in her tone made me pause. She wasn't defiant. She sounded tired, almost human. For a moment, I saw not the manipulator but the woman who'd once braided my hair for school, who'd stayed up sewing Halloween costumes long after midnight. "Fine," I said softly. "You can stay, but please just watch. No speeches, no announcements, just be here. She nodded, and for a few precious hours, she actually was. She sat quietly beside my grandmother, clapped after the toasts, even smiled when the dogs delivered the rings again for photos. When we danced, I caught her watching, a hand pressed to her chest like she was memorizing the scene. It was only later, long after the music ended, that I realized she hadn't come to surrender. She had come to document. The next morning, my phone exploded with notifications. My mother had posted a full album on Facebook titled The First of Two Celebrations. The caption read, "Our beautiful daughter's mountain ceremony. Next up, the city reception for everyone who couldn't attend yesterday." The comments poured in. "Can't wait. So thoughtful to include everyone. See you Sunday." I sat there, numb, staring at the screen. Mark saw my expression and didn't need to ask. "She's doing it anyway." I nodded. "She's using our wedding as marketing for hers." He sighed. "Then we make it clear. One statement, no explanations." We drafted a post together. It was simple, direct, and painfully polite. "We're grateful to everyone who joined us yesterday to celebrate our marriage in the mountains. There are no additional events planned. Any other gatherings are not connected to us." I pressed post. Within an hour, my mother's caption disappeared. Within 2, her entire album was gone. But she didn't call. Not that day, not the next. The silence felt different this time. It wasn't waiting to strike. It was retreating. The mountain air still lingered on my dress when I hung it in the closet. The lake smell, the pine, the faint perfume of freedom. I stood there a long time, breathing it in, until Mark came up behind me, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You did it," he whispered. I shook my head. Not yet, but almost. Because I knew that the real wedding wasn't what had just happened. It was what came next, deciding what kind of daughter I would be now that I'd finally stopped being hers. And as the evening light faded across the window, I realized something quiet and undeniable. Peace doesn't always arrive like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like distance. For almost a month after the wedding, I lived in a strange quiet. Not peace exactly. Peace is gentle. This was heavier, but there was a stillness that I hadn't felt in years. I woke up without checking my phone for incoming instructions disguised as love. The mornings felt clean. I made coffee without the background hum of anxiety that used to accompany everything that carried her voice. Mark and I returned from a short honeymoon by the lake, only 2 days away but long enough to make the world tilt back into proportion. We unpacked slowly. I folded my dress into its box, not a relic but a record, proof that I'd built something real with my own hands. Every now and then I caught myself waiting for the next wave, the inevitable call, the guilt message, the apology laced with demand. But the silence stretched, and eventually began to mean something different. When my phone finally rang, it was my father. "She's calmer now," he said. That was his entire opening. He didn't have to specify who. He asked if we could meet. "Just coffee, nothing dramatic." I hesitated. I wasn't ready, but curiosity has always been my undoing. We met at a small cafe halfway between our houses. My father arrived first, looking older, as if the whole saga had carved time directly into his face. He ordered espresso for both of us, out of habit. Then, after a long pause, he said quietly, "She wanted me to tell you she's sorry." The word sounded foreign coming from him, like something he had to rehearse. "Sorry for what?" I asked. He stirred his cup. "For getting carried away. For forgetting that it was your day, not hers." I stared at him, trying to read between the lines. "Did she say that, or is that what you wish she meant?" He gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe both." I didn't press. He looked too tired for honesty. "She won't call you," he added after a moment. "She thinks giving you space is the right thing." "That's new for her," I said, not sarcastic, just surprised. He nodded. "You scared her this time. Not because you yelled, you didn't, but because you didn't come back when she expected you to. She doesn't know how to exist without the last word." There was a strange tenderness in his voice. It wasn't defense, it was grief. When we left, he hugged me. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a transaction. 2 more weeks passed before she reached out. Not a call, a letter. A real one, written in her perfect cursive, the kind that always made grocery lists look like invitations. The envelope smelled faintly of her perfume, the one I'd known my whole life, bergamot and lilies, sharp and sentimental. The first line read, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you'll understand me." She wrote about growing up in a house where reputation was survival, where family meant attendance, where silence meant shame. She wrote that when she imagined my wedding, she saw her own youth replayed, the music, the faces, the affirmation that her life had meant something because people showed up to witness it. She said she hadn't realized until too late that I wasn't chasing the same proof. At the end, she wrote, "You did what I never could, you said no, and still built something beautiful. I don't know whether to be proud or jealous. Maybe both. I hope one day you'll let me see you again without flinching." There was no defense, no manipulation, just the rawness of someone finally speaking in the right tense. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it back carefully and left it on my desk. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't a sentence. It's a language you relearn one quiet syllable at a time. When I finally saw her again, it was at my grandmother's birthday lunch. A small gathering, 12 people, just family. The air smelled like roasted peppers and basil. She walked in late, holding a cake box, her posture straight but her eyes uncertain. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi." We didn't hug. We didn't need to. During lunch, she mostly listened. When she did speak, she asked about our new apartment, our jobs, the dogs. No subtle jabs, no guilt woven into her tone, just conversation. I kept waiting for the performance, for the old rhythm to reappear, but it didn't. Maybe she'd finally learned silence not as punishment, but as respect. As people started leaving, she lingered. My grandmother pretended to fuss with the dishes to give us space. "I got your letter," I said quietly. "I know." She smiled a little, almost embarrassed. It felt strange, writing instead of calling, but maybe that was the point. "It was," I said. A long pause. "Was it a good wedding?" she asked. Her voice cracked just enough to reveal the truth underneath. She wanted to know if happiness existed without her. "It was," I said. "It was small and honest and enough." She nodded. "Then I'm glad." Something unknotted in my chest then. Not complete forgiveness, but the kind of release that lets you breathe again. We didn't fix everything. We didn't hug and cry and promise eternal peace. We just stood there in the kitchen, 2 women who had finally stopped trying to win the same argument. That night back home, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights flicker like distant memories. Mark joined me, his hand finding mine. "Did it go okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "For once it wasn't a battle." He smiled. "That sounds like peace." I thought about it. Maybe. Or maybe it's just quiet acceptance. He nodded. "Sometimes that's better." I looked up at the night sky, dark and vast, and felt something I hadn't in a long time, not victory, not loss, just stillness. My mother hadn't changed completely, and maybe she never would, but I had. And that, I realized, was enough. Because love without boundaries isn't love. It's ownership. And I was finally free.